Hello, everybody. Hope you're having a fantastic week. Today, we're going to continue talking about the build up to the American Revolution. Some of the stuff that we've talked about so far will be familiar. I'm going to reiterate a few things that we've talked about. And then we're going to continue this build up of why the colonists wanted to rebel against the British government. So let's talk about some vocabulary first. So the word revolution. So when we use the word revolution, which is different than what you use it or how you use it in your science classes, for history purposes, the revolution is when people change their government by force. So people get tired of the government, they don't like how they're being treated, so people rise up and overthrow the government. An act. So all an act is a law. Is a very similar. Usually, would be a king or a queen that would pass an act, and it would be considered a law for the colonies and uh, Britain itself. Boycott. This is a word that you will see over and over again in our history class. We'll see it here, and then we'll see it in some later units as well. So the word boycott is refusing to do something in order to make a point. So you can either refuse to buy something, you can refuse to do a service, you can refuse to pay for a service in order to prove a point. A lot of times people do this for political reasons. Massacre. Massacre is to violently kill a large group of people. So down here, as the picture, you'll see this image again later. And this is a picture of a massacre. If you see the soldiers on the right-hand side, and then there are civilians, people on the left-hand side, who are in this picture unarmed, and the soldiers on the right are just killing them. So that's why it's called a massacre. They're killing unarmed people. So we have talked about a little bit of what led up to the revolution. But we're going to continue with some more of these events today. So as you can see, here is a timeline of the revolution. Some of these should look familiar. Between the French and Indian War and the Proclamation of 1763 and the Stamp Act. We have talked about those. But there are a few more acts that we need to talk about. The Townshend Act, the Townshend Act, the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, the Intolerable Acts, and the Continental Congress. So I'll pause it for a second. If you want to pause the video and look at this, you can. So the first one we talked about in the last class we had, which was the French and the Indian War. And remember, that is between the French and the Indians, who are on one side, against the British and the colonists, who are on the other. And if you remember, the colonists and the British own the East Coast, and the French, who are aligned with the Native Americans, have much of central modern day of the United States and up into Canada. And the cause of this war is because the British want to expand. Remember, they are not the only. The British are not the only one in North America. North America also has the French, as I just mentioned, and the Spanish, who control most of central and southern of the Americans. So much of South America and Central America are owned by the Spanish. And this is gonna fall out where the British win, and they're going to get territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. So they wanted more territory. They won the war. Great. They got more territory. But the king decides He wants to pass this proclamation of 1763. And that's going to be where uh, laws are going to stop the colonists moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. And if you see down here the line, the Appalachians run all the way down the East Coast. So you cannot go past those and settle if you're a colonist, because the British did not want another incident with the French or the Native Americans who were predominantly in those areas. And because the colonists and the British had just fought a war and they're getting taxed for the war, which we'll talk about in a minute, and they won the war, they have more land, but they can't settle in it, that's going to make the colonists angry. That's the whole reason they went to the war, is to get some more land. Well, as we discussed, wars are not cheap. So in 1765, they're going to pass the Stamp Act. And that's just a tax on all paper products. So um, the British need more money after the war. Wars are expensive. French and Indians lost, and the British got more land, but they still need more money. So because of all the paper products that are getting more heavily taxed, the colonists are going to boycott. Remember, that's a vocabulary word. It's to refuse to do something. So in this instance, they're going to boycott the British goods. So they're going to refuse to buy these British goods made out of paper. So that's their essentially like protest. They're protesting this tax by not buying it, by not buying paper products. And remember, that covered newspapers, playing cards, books, anything made out of paper that people would need. So that leads us to the Townshend Act of 1767. So the British are fed up with the colonists not paying this tax. So what they're going to do, instead of cutting back on the taxes, they're going to continually add more taxes. So instead of just for paper, they're going to increase tax on glass. So put windows in your house, lead, paint, paper, and tea. And we'll get to that tea one in a second. So this is still going back to the French and Indian War. The British put this in place because they need money to pay for the soldiers left behind to protect the colonies after the war. So they still were trying to get more money from the French and Indian War to recuperate some of the money they lost fighting that war. And two, they're also trying to get money to sustain or to keep troops in the colonies. And guess what? Surprise, surprise, the colonists are going to boycott the British goods again. So that's two different acts that are trying to heavily tax the colonists for their protection. So the colonists are supposed to pay the British government so they can afford to put soldiers in the colonies to protect them. And that's twice that the American colonists have boycotted or not bought these products in order to not pay the taxes. So you'll see that trend. You should start seeing that. So, so that's going to lead us up into the Boston Massacre in 1770. And we'll get heavily into this in an activity towards the end of class. So in Boston, people are protesting. They're not happy. There's a lot of British soldiers in the streets. They're not happy that they're there. And what's going to happen is people are going to get it, the colonists are going to get in a protest. They're going to get up in the faces of the British. They're going to get yell at them and tell them to go back home, back to England. And we don't know what happened exactly, but either the colonists shot for, well, the picture will explain. The picture shows one perspective of it, and that is drawn by a founding father, and we'll talk about that later. But we're not quite sure what started it. So it's either, the colonists yelling fire and somebody thought it was commander yelling fire, or somebody shot by accident, and then everybody else followed afterwards because somebody thought they were supposed to shoot. Um, so the colonists are over here, they're protesting, they're going to be throwing snowballs and maybe a few other things like, rocks and oyster shells. And, the soldiers are like, you can get hurt if you get hit by a rock, you can bust your head, start bleeding. And because of this protesting and people getting violent and people accidentally, getting hurt or purposely getting hurt, what's going to happen is it's going to cause the British soldiers to protect themselves, and they're going to have to shoot. And like I said, we don't know exactly why or what happened. It's either because the commander said so, or somebody did something, or somebody was just trying to protect themselves. So we don't really know exactly what happened. But the effect of this is that if you take the picture for what it's worth, because that's essentially the image that was printed in all the newspapers back then, all you see is the British soldiers, in a line, look like the commander who's in the back right here, telling them to fire. And what that's going to do is that's going to make the colonists and the rest of the colonists, not just in Boston, but throughout the Mid-Atlantic and Southern colonies as well, start to be angry, get a lot angrier at the British. Now, the further south you go, the more connected they are to British because, tobaccos, they're selling them and they're making a lot of money. New England is where a lot of the people who don't agree with the British live. So all it's going to do is it's just going to make people really angry at the British.